Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you saw the title of this video, you know we're discussing A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, aka MTV meets Freddy Krueger. Let's get into it. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master is a 1988 film starring Robert Englund, Lisa Wilcox, and is directed by Rennie Harland. Freddy Krueger returns once again to terrorize the dreams of the remaining Dream Warriors, as well as those of a young woman who may be able to defeat him for good. So, The Dream Master is definitely the MTV Freddy movie. From the music to the visual effects. This is when Freddy was totally 80s. And because of that, out of all of these films in this series, for better or for worse, this one feels like probably the biggest time capsule. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing really depends on how in love you are with that era and whether you like the idea of infusing that MTV culture with a Freddy movie. I'm in the middle. I do love that era. It's probably my favorite era of definitely horror movies, but I can't get over how disappointing this movie is. And unfortunately, the 80s nostalgia doesn't save it. And I'll get into my thoughts on the 80s aesthetic of this movie more later in this video. So right out the gate, you do get the three main survivors back from Dream Warriors. The last three remaining Elm Street kids, Kristen, Joey, and Kincaid, which leads me into my first negative of this movie, which is probably more of a mixed opinion, but you don't get Patricia Arquette back as Kristen. And from everything I've read and seen, I'm not really sure what the actual reason is. But it seems like it was due to a pregnancy based on something I read. I don't remember where I read that. But either way, she's replaced with Tuesday Knight in this film, who, to her credit, actually does do a serviceable enough job at the role. She's just a little whiny and annoying in my opinion, and doesn't hold a candle to Patricia Arquette, who really knocked that role out of the park. I mean, Patricia Arquette is synonymous with the character of Kristen, but Tuesday Knight does do a decent enough job, like I said, for what little she's in the movie, which I'll get into a little bit more on that later, but it's just so visually jarring, especially when you watch these movies back to back like I just did to review them. Patricia Arquette, like I said, just did such a great job. You really don't want to see anybody else do the role, so you're automatically apprehensive toward it. At least that's how I feel, but I could have probably forgiven that if they would have just handled the characters better. So, in my Dream Warriors review, I mentioned how that movie perfectly demonstrates how to kill a returning fan favorite character. So, it's like the studio clearly knows how to do it, which really begs the question, why didn't they do it again here? Joey and Kincaid are killed right out the gate, and then Kristen gets killed not much further into the movie. Freddy officially kills off the last three remaining Elm Street kids, and they do all of this just so they can give the spotlight to a brand new character, Alice, played by Lisa Wilcox, who, again, technically does perfectly fine in the role she's given. I just don't understand why any of these creative choices were necessary to begin with. You had a smash hit with Dream Warriors. Why not just continue with those characters and that plotline? They had a proven success with audiences. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Because at least for me anyways, I feel like this movie just completely cheapens the victory at the end of Dream Warriors. Obviously, they just wanted to set up Dream Child for some reason, which they still could have done. They could have still introduced Alice and made her work alongside the trio, and then they could have just found a more creative and clever and more respectful way to write them out of the next movie so they could focus on Alice completely. But that's not what they did, so I'm left having to grade this movie on what it actually accomplished. But everything I've said so far is not the most offensive part of this movie, not by a long shot. So anytime you're making a franchise film like this where you have a returning villain, you're tasked in each movie with having to find a more creative and clever way to constantly keep bringing that villain back. And this is actually a pretty important task because in some cases, this being one of them, it can really make or break the entire movie. Now, I've seen some silly stuff in these movies. I mean, Jason's resurrection in Jason Lives was pretty silly, but it was a huge nod to Frankenstein. In fact, the whole movie was. So not only did it make sense within the context of that movie, in fact, spoiler alert for that future franchise ranking, that's my favorite Friday movie. So Jason Lives is an example of how to be a little silly, but do it right. But sometimes filmmakers lean so far into it that they end up completely disrespecting the characters and insulting the audience, like they do here. This is without a doubt one of the dumbest resurrection scenes of any character in any movie I have ever seen. Second only to Leprechaun in Space, but we won't talk about that here. But Freddy is literally resurrected by a dog pissing.
You blew it!
So another problem I have is this movie's aesthetic. The entire movie looks like it was filmed to be an MTV music video, from the dream sequences to the cinematography. We get very sensational dream sequences here, which if you saw my other Nightmare reviews, you'll know that's something I do not like. In my Dream Warriors review, I mentioned that's the movie where they crack the door open, but in this movie, we are officially in funny Freddy territory, and that's not the Freddy I like. You have characters literally using nunchucks against Freddy in this movie, and martial arts, and doing backflips, and it's just so silly and completely takes me out of the movie. I truly despise it. I really have no idea what they were thinking here, but the tone of this movie really goes off the rails and sets the stage for the rest of the franchise moving forward, and unfortunately, we never fully recover from it, but we do get close in 1994, in my opinion anyways. From my understanding from all the research I've done on this movie, New Line was just in a hurry to capitalize on the success of Dream Warriors. So they rushed the production of this film, and it ended up being a half-baked and sloppy, disjointed mess of a movie. The director, Rennie Harland, was basically homeless at the time and going into New Line every day, constantly begging them to give him a job, and because they were in such a hurry to just throw something together, they finally caved and gave him the job of directing this movie. The script was literally being written as the movie was being filmed, which is almost never a recipe for success. They didn't really seem to care about the quality of the film. It seems like they almost felt like horror fans at the time didn't really care what they got. They were just happy with any scraps they were thrown, or maybe they just assumed everybody was checked out, but I find that hard to believe, seeing as Dream Warriors was such a big hit with the audiences. But what's funny about all of this is I do believe this is actually one of, if not the most financially successful sequel, unless you count Freddy vs. Jason. But unfortunately, this is not the worst movie in the franchise, and it does actually have some good qualities. So, getting into my positives. While I don't like the way she felt shoehorned into the story, I do feel like Lisa Wilcox does a good enough job here. As much as I hate that they just threw away our previous characters, I do like the new characters they introduced. I just wish they could have been introduced better, and perhaps in a better movie. But anything good I have to say about this movie just feels superficial, because the movie as a whole just feels very weak and kind of repetitive. I may not like Dream Warriors as much as a lot of other people, but I do think it's a solid movie, and it was a great launching pad that deserved a better follow-up than what we got. But the last real positive I have for this movie, and it's a weak one at that, is the death of Freddy at the end. If this had been where they ended the franchise, it would have been a pretty cool-ish ending for the character. Alice ends up using the Dream Master against him, and the souls of all his victims of the past basically destroy him. It's not mind-boggling or game-changing or anything, but it was a decent enough way to end the movie and the character of Freddy. Then, of course, you have Robert Englund back. He always technically does a great job as Freddy, even if the movie around him sucks, but I really can't stand what he does with the character in these later movies, and I'm sure a lot of that is studio interference, but it doesn't change the fact that the end result is something I don't like at all. Sadly, though, that's the end of my positives for this movie, and I know it kind of felt like I was still dogging on this movie in the positive section, but I can't help it. I honestly had to really reach and dig just to come up with the good things I had to say about it. Unfortunately, this movie just doesn't have a lot of redeeming qualities for me. And so for a rating, I'm giving this movie a 5.5. But if you like this movie, I think that's awesome. You can let me know what you think of it down in the comments section and we can discuss it. Also, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And in the meantime, like and share this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe and I'll catch you guys in the next one.